welcome those who are here, and as people join us, we'll hopefully form a great group for a discussion today. Can I begin by introducing myself? I'm Veronica Pardo. I'm the CEO of Multicultural Arts Victoria. I live and work on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and we exist on stolen land. I hail from a small country in South America called Uruguay. It has a population of 3 million. It is also a colonised country of European settlers, predominantly Spanish and Portuguese. The indigenous peoples of Uruguay are the Charrua, Chana, Arachan and Guarani people, and they've all been wiped out due to territorial occupation, disease and war. So I stand in solidarity with all Indigenous peoples across the world and their collective struggles for reparations and for Indigenous sovereignty. A few housekeeping things before I introduce my co-host for the session today, Dr. Priya Srinivasan. It's Easter this weekend, so we won't be having lunches on Friday or Monday. So Friday the 10th or Monday the 13th. And there had been a scheduled conversation with Frank Panucci from the Australia Council for this Friday. That's going to be moved to Tuesday, the 14th of April. So our lunch is being recorded and it will be streamed live and available after on the Little Lunch Online website. We're going to stick to the 30-minute time allocation because we're working with Auslan interpreters and captioners. And we want to be respectful of that. So we might get started by asking you to introduce yourself in the chat function and let us know what land you're on today. There is live captioning available and you just need to click on the captions icon to get access to that. And we have Linda from Auslan Stage Left joining us today. And so if you're participating via Auslan Interpreting, just click on Linda and you'll be able to pin it. If you want to ask a question, just pop it into the chat and we'll keep an eye on that and make sure that we're attending to your questions as well. And Priya and I intend to talk for a little while and then kind of open up the discussion to you as well. So start thinking about what you might want to ask or contribute. And of course, keep your mics muted unless you're speaking. So let me begin now then formally by introducing Dr. Priya Srinivasan. Priya is an amazing friend and colleague of mine here in Melbourne. She's a choreographer, a curator, a scholar. Her work has combined theory and practice towards social justice through art. And I've been fortunate to see her work and her performances, which really prioritise feminist decolonising practices to make visible minority women's histories. She's presented at major festivals and events around the world. She's done amazing intercultural collaboration here in Australia with First Nations artists, which is toured in India. She's the author of an award-winning book, Sweating Saris, Indian Dance as Transnational Labour. She's the co-director of Sangam, the Performing Arts Festival of South Asia and Diaspora, and I could go on, but I won't. You can read her bio on the website. So I'm going to begin by inviting Priya just to tell us a little bit more about herself, particularly her background, and you'll immediately get a sense of what we're in for today in terms of our discussion. So Priya, over to you for just a brief introduction about yourself.
Namaste, everybody. I'd like to also acknowledge the Kulin Nation, the people of the Kulin Nation, and the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and we exist on stolen land. I'd also like to acknowledge my spirits, ancestors, gods, and goddesses who are also present with me today. The elders that I bring from where I originally hail, which is India and Tamil Nadu, south of India, which although was colonized and we say that we're independent, I really don't think we have decolonized ourselves. as yet. And so when I came to Australia, when I was quite young, I found myself really living in two worlds: a world that was my Indian life, which was inside my home and with other few Indians that existed, and the outside world, which was predominantly white Caucasian life. And the thing that really sort of kept me glued was access to an Indian dance form called Bharatanatyam, which was taught to me by a, uh, a remarkable person. His name is Dr. Chandravanu, and he had a PhD in anthropology. He came from Malaysia. He was a Muslim and gay, and also very knowledgeable in the Indian arts. Having that training quite when I was quite young really helped shape who I became and why my commitment to the arts continued to exist. Is that good, Veronica, to
Yeah.
start with?
That's great. And I think, look, I'm really keen to explore more about your work and your practice here in Melbourne. But first of all, I really want to talk about this kind of weird duality that's going on in terms of how people of colour, culturally diverse people are experiencing some of our present circumstances. And whilst I note that, this present sense of disadvantage can really be compounded in many of these communities, there is an eerie familiarity for so many people who've been through these kinds of experiences before of kind of being locked down, a sense of deprivation. Priya, can you tell us a little bit about, does this feel a bit familiar? Um, and what inferences might we draw from that in terms of, particularly people of color and their experiences in these kinds of crisis moments?
Well, I think it's so interesting that we're at this point in the world right now where we are literally have been told by Mother Earth to go to our rooms and to stay there and really be punished for the kind of atrocities we've committed to the beings on this planet and to everyone around us. And the sort of Indian mythologies that have told us these stories, and I think also indigenous mythologies and old cultures have told us time and time again that if we do not caretake the land that we are with, and we don't make ourselves caretakers, we're going to pay the price. And I think we are paying that price, and we're being given a vision of a possibility for change. And, some of us have experienced this coming from the different countries that we're all coming from in this country, like migrants, refugees, go through these called social isolation, war-torn conditions every day of their lives.
Mm.
While I come necessarily from a war-torn country, I do remember being in the emergency during the Indira Gandhi regime, that when she sort of declared sort of a national emergency and we were all sent to our homes, very different circumstances, but I remember that time very starkly. And also ration cards, which now happen in the supermarkets. People are being rationed for different reasons. So for me, it's really sort of eerie the ways in which not just me, but so many of us here in Australia and around the world have already experienced strange ways of, being put in our homes, being locked down, and then having to deal with that reality yet again now. And this doesn't even begin to speak of refugees left their country right in the middle of wars and had to go through so much more than what we're going through right now. So I think it's so important that we actually draw on creatives of color who actually have these kinds of experience, come with a huge sense of knowledge around how to actually exist at this time.
Yeah. Oh, and I think also, Pilar is with us, and both of us have come from Latin America at a time when our countries were riven by dictatorships. And so this, the kind of language that's being used internationally, it is certainly sending, I think, shockwaves through our community, because it is all so familiar, the language of repression, of the removal of rights, and I think that as artists in the community, it's so important, as you say, to draw strength from these people who have had these lived experiences. But it's really difficult because it's counter to the narrative around diversity that is so often promulgated in our sector, which is one of, deficit thinking. So here's a group of people who have particular needs, and we don't often think of diverse people as being an asset. But of course, those of us who come from those communities understand that we fundamentally are an asset. We bring enormous strengths and capabilities, but that's not the framing of diversity in this country. It's framed very much, I think, as a deficit or a liability. So how do we now, Priya, create a situation in which we can allow some of these artists to really lead when they are not generally in leadership roles? How do we draw upon their strengths, their experiences, to help us through this moment?
Well, I think, what Arts Front and other sort of organizations are doing to create these forums is a really great step forward to get more people into the conversation, to have different perspectives, see how we might strategize together differently, to not do what we did before, to not make people of color or sort of diversity work an addition or an add-on, but actually central to the reparation we have to go when and if this is over, we're going to be completely over. And I do think that bringing different community perspectives, different knowledges together is going to be so crucial in that process. And Veronica, the platform that you're creating, I think, is one great step forward towards that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, as we've been working on issues of equity in the arts for a very long time, whether it be from a perspective of disability or diversity. And we recognise that we have a long way to go. But one of the big issues that communities talk to us about all the time is just the lack of platforms that are available for them to showcase their work, to develop their practice, to engage in collaborations that do not necessarily fit within a kind of broader, wide aesthetic. And so we've been proposing the development of a new festival that is by, with and for people of colour, which is a place where people can really exercise self-determination and explore the kinds of work that are meaningful to them without necessarily having to always negotiate with sources of white power, where, even working, within a kind of mainstream context, a festival context or an organisational context requires enormous labour on the part of artists of colour. So we're feeling pretty lucky at this moment in time that the Australia Council has backed this vision. And so we're looking forward to getting started in 2021 with our first festival. And we've got an amazing crew of cultural leaders who are guiding us in every respect. But that doesn't mean that everyone else gets let off the hook, right? Because it's not just about us having these own spaces. It's this and I'm really, really gratified to see so much language coming from the Australia Council around equity, cultural equity, and the importance of thinking equitably about the distribution of resources. I'm really looking forward to seeing what that means and how everyone can be part of that that picture of equality, and how we must all contribute. So, I think the small to medium organisations are being challenged to contribute to save the whole. And I'd really love to see that extended further beyond just those small to medium organisations, because this is a moment, I think, where we can reset. And it would be so fantastic to think that we are not going to go back to the situations that we've come from, that actually we can do that pivot and make it permanent. So that's where I'm coming from at this moment, and the sorts of things that I'm thinking about. What do you think, Priya?
And I was going to add to that and say, in some ways, those of us working in the margins, even in Melbourne, have always kind of been sequestered. We haven't had access to studios or theatres or other spaces, so we've always actually trained at home. So this is not a new thing for many of us who practice at home, many of whom have classes at home. And so, in some ways, we've always known how to do more with less. So, this is like, welcome to our world. We've got a couple of tools we can share with you on how we've managed and how we can really offer different thinking. Um, and, also thinking around this question about solidarity and what that means right now. Like, how do we actually rethink our understandings of solidarity, and what can a feminist sort of perspective give us around solidarity? And I mean a radical, feminist of color, global South perspective, which have possible solution capabilities that we can actually use to inform how we move forward. It's not that there isn't a map out there already. Women have been writing, talking, practicing this for a very long time, and it would be fantastic if we could listen into what they're actually suggesting.
I love what you're talking about in terms of how we've made so much of scarcity. In fact, actually, we've turned scarcity into abundance. We haven't had, in our sectors, we haven't had the support in the past. And yet the work has been able to happen, and really exciting work, I think, defining work for this country. I can't wait to see what we're going to do with a bit of resources. But I think that it's really a lovely point that you make about, we know how to work in these environments of scant resources, and that could be something that we share. But I think also, it is a moment where organisations are thinking about what's important, and potentially discarding some aspects of their work in this new prioritisation. And I think we're really concerned that organisations not do that with their diversity agenda, that this is not the moment to think of this work as an optional extra, but actually as really solidifying the relevance and of your work. And I think, our message to arts organisations is that we know that things are really difficult at the moment, and that many organisations are experiencing extreme distress. But we would like to be a partner and an ally in all of this, and we believe that we've got a lot to bring to the table. And please don't take this moment to walk it back, because I think that's a big mistake. Priya, do you want to say a few last words, and then we might just open up to the gang here today and see if anyone would like to make any comments or ask any questions.
No, I think you've summed that up really well, Veronica. I totally sort of agree with the idea that diversity issues can't be an add-on at this particular moment. And if anything, I think our conversation is to really sort of get people to argue and sort of really push for continued commitment to diversity, and use it now as a strength to reorganize themselves, reorganize using different platforms, make diversity the center and not the periphery. If anything, this is to do it.
Yeah. So keen to hear from the rest of you. Any comments or questions that you have for us today? And I think we'll do that by, if you can just click on the hands up button, or else literally put your hands up, because there's not many of us. I've got a view of all of you. Pilar, why don't we go to you?
Yeah, hi, Veronica. It's great to see you all. Look, just a thought, really. It's a bit unformed, but Priya was talking about, the feminists of the global South, and how can we get some of that thinking into what's happening now. And And I was thinking that some of the stuff that I'm coming across is this idea of the reclaiming the realm of the domestic. The realm of the domestic as the realm of women has been really kind of demonized, or, you know, not paid, treated really poorly as a space that is not worthy of leadership roles. And now that we are actually, in a way, confined to the space of the domestic, I wonder how we can begin to redefine and politicize that domestic space, because probably the creative thinking may well come from our homes, from our space. And I guess you were talking about at the beginning, you know, we get an insight in people's homes. And so anyway, just an unformed thought about this idea of politicizing the domestic place right now, when we can't actually come together on the street, as many in Latin America have been coming for a while, especially women and feminists, regaining those. You know, there were 2 million women on International Women's Day in Chile, the largest, you know, feminist protest in the world. So it's so much going on there. It's very exciting. And now we're confined back to the domestic realm. So, yeah.
Do you want to respond to that, Priya?
Sure. I think that's fabulous what you're saying, Pilar. I feel like, in a way, we can really rethink the question of the domestic space and turn it around. I mean, I just want to start with a slightly different take on what you just said before I respond to it, which is we're also seeing a rise in domestic violence. I think we've all heard this happening, that the domestic is not a safe space for so many people right now, so many women and children around the world, and that what we take for granted as a safe space may not be for many others. Having said that, I also have been really motivated by a talk that I attended group, thinkers that are reimagining what the organizing might look like from our homes, to say that we cannot be complacent in this particular moment. We need to really rethink what it is that's going to happen, when we're to get out of use internet and the media to our advantage right now to do this organizing from these domestic spaces. So I think the potential is definitely there. And if we can actually tap into global voices from the global South, it really will enable us to connect in a very different way. The teach-in had 10,000 people attending it from around the world, and things like that. If we actually think both domestically from the home into the global, something that Homi Bhabha, the post-colonial theorist, used to discuss, how can we actually really rethink this? What would it look like?
I think
and what would it mean for artists?
Yeah.
To think like that, have that kind of global solidarity.
I'm interested in what you're saying, Priya, about the idea of building platforms of solidarity from home. But I'm also really conscious of the fact that, yes, home can be a dangerous place, and it's also a really unequal place. So in terms of communities that have access to this kind of infrastructure that's required to make these connections, to be online, to put their work online, and I really want to urge arts organisations, as they're moving more and more into online spaces, to think about the inequities that also sit behind some of these platforms. Not everyone has the same type of access. And how do we create opportunities to connect individuals that are really low tech in a high tech kind of context, but don't require, really, fast internet and all of these sorts of things that we just take for granted, but not everybody has access to. And I've been really conscious of the fact that as the sector moves swiftly to put their content online, we are once again seeing the same inequities that play out in our daily lives in this new environment. So, and I'm not really seeing a lot of thinking about how diversity or disability, for example, may be particularly, impacted in this way. So it's, keen to think about these ideas, but also to always put that equity lens on them and think about who's being excluded by virtue of, lack of infrastructure and, economic power.
Mm.
Pilar, did you want to say something else about that?
Oh, look, I agree. I mean, I think there is an issue of technology, and because I've had my head for so long in Latin America, knowing that there was such an incredible social movement that it erupted and it was sustained through street participation. People on the streets, creating on the streets. The amount of art that people have been making there has been incredible, and the quality and the politicization of that art. But so. Yeah, big question is, how do they translate that incredible political activism into a space like this, which is totally the opposite and the antithesis, and also in a country that doesn't necessarily have the technology. So look, I've got more questions than answers, but it is really an imperative that we think about how these things change, and I'm be looking towards what's happening there, maybe to get some inspiration on how it could be replicated elsewhere as well. Because a lot of the thinking is happening in these places where the inequity is so extreme that people are responding so articulated and in mass, because they if you like, their oppression has been there for so long. It's not the case in here, obviously, but it's always been simmering, bubbling under, and certainly for some communities it does the reality.
That's right. Ria, did you want to respond?
Well, I was just actually going to go off what both of you are saying, just to say we also need to be really cautious about the fact that even though we have access to online platforms right now, we don't know the kind of long-term impact of that, in the sense that even now, I don't know how many of you are finding this, 3 weeks ago, Zoom was, nothing most people used, and now suddenly Zoom is what everybody's using. Also, the internet platforms are being run by corporations that at any point can withdraw that. And so our dependency on these modes of engagement, we need to really be watchful of what we're doing, and definitely be finding other modes of communication, other means, other ways. I'm not sure what they are, but I think we need to start rethinking different ways of engaging, and not just through the online digital realm, which is both dangerous and at the same time can be very freeing for many people around the world.
I'll draw your attention to a comment that Bong has just put on in the chat about the fact that we need to look at virtual resistance and what form that takes in terms, Pilar, to pick up your point, what do those women who've been gathering in their thousands all over the world to sing songs of, resistance to oppression and male violence, what do they do now in this context? I feel like we could go on for hours with this topic, and perhaps we'll have another chance to pick it up at some other date on a little lunch. We've got 2 minutes before we have to end. In any other sort of burning comments or questions before we finish? Maybe you pop your hand up. No, I can't see anybody. Well, I think, look, what I'm really keen to leave everyone with is a sense that these are unprecedented times for some, and for some people it's a really scarily familiar time. And I really encourage you to reach out to your communities, if you do have relationships with communities of colour, to ask them not just what they need, but what they can bring. I think it's a really optimum time for us actually to treat people like they have something to give rather than something to take. And have a think, and if you're not connected, I mean, there are some amazing diversity arts organisations all over the country doing incredible work. Some are already here today. And, I think that's your first port of call if those relationships aren't already there. But Look, I'd like to thank you all for participating today, and in particular to Priya for joining me as a co-host. And I hope that we've given you some food for thought. And I really look forward to catching up at another moment where we can keep the conversation going. Thank you very much to Linda for interpreting, to our captioners for captioning, and of course to Feral Arts Front for the amazing work that they do, keeping us connected and on point, not just prattling on about, I think, not relevant things, but really that kind of amazing advocacy for the sector, which is unique. So I hope you will have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you all.
Thanks, Veronica. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.